Hello viewers, this is Wolf here with another video, and today I wanted to do something a little bit different. Something different to close off the year 2020 as well as close out the 8th generation of game consoles such as the PS4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, so on and so forth, now that the PS5 and the new Xbox have been in circulation for a while. In this video, I want to compile a list that highlights my top 10 games of the 8th generation that I've played. This list will be based on games that I personally thought were the most impressive and some of the best of the generation, whether it be from a technical standpoint, a deep and engaging narrative, or really fun, immersive, and innovative gameplay. I will attempt to avoid spoilers as much as possible in the event that a game on this list is a game that someone may be currently playing through or may have on their to-do list. I originally wanted to do this video prior to the end of 2020, but I did get distracted with other personal matters. But with all that said, let's begin. Starting at number 10 on the list is Destiny 1. Destiny 1 was a very interesting game for me since I have a deep interest in space and sci-fi material. It was a game that combined a lot of elements together from other game genres such as tight FPS gameplay, an interesting leveling and character building system from RPGs, as well as the addicting gameplay loop and community-focused events and atmosphere provided by MMOs. It was something that I hadn't really seen before, and it had me hooked as soon as I first got my boots on the ground. It wasn't until I completed my first raid where I obtained a true appreciation for the game. I actually first started playing Destiny 1 shortly before the House of Wolves expansion came out, so I didn't experience much of the problems that Day 1 players had with the game. There was plenty of content waiting for me at that time, as well as the Vault of Glass and Crota raids. The raids and community-focused events were honestly the best parts about Destiny. It was what kept me playing the game almost exclusively for a year and a half, and created a huge backlog in my gaming list. Then came the Taken King expansion, which took everything I loved about the game and made it 10 times better. They added in so much more interesting gameplay elements such as the introduction of the third subclass, enemy cosmetic drops such as the Scion Flare's cybernetic cloaks, the introduction of swords, the community-generated events inside the Dreadnought, and one of my favorite raids in the game, and so much more. The game wasn't perfect, of course, and it did suffer from its fair share of issues, such as the PvP space generally not always being balanced, aim assist being an actual stat in the game, and certain public events and PvP modes just generally not being fun in my opinion. But despite those issues, I still had a lot of fun with the game. The Taken King expansion, as well as the ones that came after it, with a lot more improvements and my increasing enjoyment of the game is what puts Destiny 1 in my number 10 slot. Number 9 on the list is Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Xenoblade Chronicles has always been one of my favorite RPGs of all time ever since I played the first one. The series took on an MMO-styled combat system that I'm generally not the biggest fan of, but somehow made incredibly enjoyable. The idea of movement not really mattering since you can't really dodge attacks without the use of some form of evasion stat was something that always bothered me since I love action RPGs, but Xenoblade found a way to make movement matter by having your abilities react differently and gain certain advantages depending on your position relative to the enemy. The massively expansive and detailed worlds was also another element I loved about the series, as well as the great storytelling. Xenoblade Chronicles X quickly took the spot as my favorite Xenoblade game as it appealed to my love of sci-fi, mechs, introducing a very interesting online co-op feature, and making side quests and side characters actually fleshed out, interesting characters with interesting stories that really pull you in and make you want to complete as many as you can to completely immerse yourself with the world. With Xenoblade Chronicles 2, I feel they took the best of both worlds, combined them together, perfected the combat system, and introduced a wide array of new features and quality of life changes that made me feel like this was honestly one of the best RPGs I've played in a long time. I loved the blade and driver system, which allowed you to create new randomized allies, as well as have a chance at creating a unique named ally. It's a system that I've loved for its ability to create a unique and almost intimate experience for every player when it comes to party structure. They also made the combat system a lot more engaging this time around due to its use of the blade combo and driver combo systems. There's a lot less downtime in combat this time around, and a lot more things that you need to actively be ready for and thinking about, which gives it almost an action RPG feel, but in a different way. The system really changes things up from the usual positioning and topple launch combos that you would usually focus on in the previous games. The storytelling was also an area that I thought was very well done, as well as seeing how it links certain things together. Honestly, I can't say there were very many things that I disliked about Xenoblade Chronicles 2 other than the art style. Even though it eventually grew on me the more and more I played the game, I'm definitely not the biggest fan of the overly anime approach that they took with Xenoblade Chronicles 2's art style. Especially when you compare it to the past two iterations. I thought that the difference was a little strange, especially when you look at certain characters' designs, like Rex for example. Other than that, I thought Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was an amazing experience through and through, and lands easily in my number 9 slot. For number 8, we have Devil May Cry 5. Devil May Cry really came back incredibly strong after the disappointing release of the reboot title. DMC5 was something that I was waiting for what seemed like an eternity, but boy did it ever deliver. The introduction of 3 playable characters was a great choice, and it really kept things fresh as you progressed through the story since each character played entirely different from each other. It even lends itself well to a couch co-op playthrough with 2 other buddies since you can easily designate characters to each person as the game has you switch off from character to character pretty frequently, which was something I enjoyed doing on my second playthrough. DMC5 also had interesting online functionality in the way that levels that overlap or have you make a choice on what character to use for the level would actually feature another player who is playing the opposite character of your choosing at the same time as you in a different route or section of that same level, but still in parallel with you. I found it to be a very cool and unintrusive way to feature other players going through the story, especially since their actions may actually open up a secret path in your section of the level, and vice versa. The gameplay was incredible, and the satisfaction and reward of completing encounters and levels was pretty high considering the game was actually pretty damn hard, especially on the higher difficulties, which really rewards someone who's mastered the combo system and dodging. Speaking of the combo system, I love the way they integrated progressive music into the combo system of the game. The way that more and more elements of the music opens up to you the better you perform and the higher your style rating increases is such a good way to keep the adrenaline pumping and make you feel like a total badass, but also give you really good audible feedback as well. The way they changed up Nero by giving him the Devil Breaker feature was also a very welcome change, and adds a lot to your strategy and options with Nero. I gotta say that V was also another great addition to the game. He has such a vastly different playstyle from the rest of the characters that, depending on the player, may take a little getting used to, but when you do, feels really good and satisfying when you get into the nice flow of combos and executions. I also found that the character models and visuals were incredibly good for the genre. I don't think there's another game within this genre that looks as good as DMC5, and it really went a long way in making the experience very immersive and great to watch, along with the amazing animation work. It really made the characters seem very lifelike. The soundtrack was super good overall for DMC5, and the boss fights were honestly some of the best in the series. DMC3 used to be my favorite in the series, but after giving 5 a spin, I have to say that 5 takes that spot easily, as well as taking my number 8 spot on the list. Sitting in the number 7 spot is Death Stranding. This title was a very interesting one since it seemed to be very divisive among consumers. It seemed to be an either you love it or you hate it type of situation, where some found the gameplay to be either very boring or fun and rewarding, while others found certain aspects such as the story to be either very convoluted or very well written. I was on the side of people who enjoyed every aspect of Death Stranding a lot, even more so than I was even expecting. It was a journey that I never knew I needed in my life until I finally embarked on it. This tale tells a very personal story that was heavily inspired by Kojima's journey through the gaming industry after leaving Konami, and subsequently reforming his company into an independent studio. A lot of the in-between of that journey is represented through Sam and his struggles, as well as one of the major narrative themes of the game, forming connections. This was a theme that resonated deeply within me since it related almost one-to-one to a very significant point in my life, and cleverly dealt with a lot of struggles that I had to go through. As I watched Sam play out his role, every interaction felt almost like an extension of myself. It was this closeness of narrative and real-life intermingling that made Death Stranding a very intimate and personal experience for me, and something that I've never experienced to that same degree in another video game. I also thoroughly enjoyed the gameplay structure a lot more than I thought I would, despite my initial impressions after watching trailers leading up to its release. There was just something I found to be really addicting and a lot of fun about delivering packages across large, hostile expanses of land. Planning and plotting strategies and paths through the map really gave me that strategic air that I love about stealth games, while also giving me that anxious and gritty feeling of survival when out there dealing with the harshness of nature. The fact that every little movement you make and every animation is critical to maintaining your balance and stability when under heavy load just makes the experience very tense and adds a lot to the survival aspect of things. It was an experience that I found to be very rewarding, and it all culminated into one of my favorite moments of the game, the snowy mountain climb. I also thought the lonely atmosphere of the game, but also how other players could indirectly help with the restructuring of America from afar, was a concept that was executed very well. Overall, I thought the story was very well written, the characters and acting were very enjoyable to watch, the visuals were fantastic, and the gameplay was a very unique, fun, and rewarding experience. Death Stranding is not a game for everyone, but its impact on me is certainly why I consider it one of the best games of the generation and why it sits in my number 7 spot. Slashing its way through to number 6 is Ghost of Tsushima. This journey was a scintillating tale about reclaiming and protecting your homeland. Amongst the fierce bloodshed of the Mongol invasion of 13th century Tsushima Island, there were beautiful vistas, jaw-dropping architecture, and the warmth of nature. Where there was death, suffering, and strife, there was also peace, tranquility, and hope. This is the world I came to love and enjoy from Ghost of Tsushima. The execution of many of the game's systems and concepts was something I felt was done very well, and it gave me a whole new appreciation for something. That thing was contrast. It was the contrast of going from bloody and oftentimes brutal combat to discovering a hot spring and meditating on past events, or kneeling down by the side of a river and creating haiku while taking in nature's beauty and then creating your own personal headband based on the concept of your haiku. It was this embodiment of contrast that truly made me appreciate Ghost of Tsushima's world and atmosphere. The visual effects, especially on the particle effect side of things, were absolutely beautiful. From the blood spilled from your enemies staining your clothing and armor, to the fallen leaves being kicked up while walking through leaf-saturated areas. All of this led to a beautifully immersive experience. The combat was also another aspect I felt was executed extremely well. The animations, movement, the preciseness of everything all felt amazing. In fact, I don't think I've experienced too many games of this genre with melee combat anywhere near this level of polish. Factor in the many stances, gadgets, abilities, and strategic options at your disposal, and it all leads to a very enjoyable and satisfying experience. Another area I felt the game excelled in was voice acting, especially on the English side. I loved the fact that all of the English voice actors, barring maybe one character, sounded like a Japanese person speaking English. Almost all of the characters had a thick Japanese accent, and I felt the acting was convincing as well. All of this coalesced to achieve a level of authenticity toward it, which I really appreciated, especially if you're someone who prefers English dubs. This execution just adds a cherry on top of the immersion cake that Ghost of Tsushima is serving. After a bit of meditation, I have come to realize this as my number 6 on the list. Jumping into the number 5 spot is Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1. Another well-received yet fairly divisive game on the list, Final Fantasy VII Remake managed to make a very good impression on me. From the fast-paced action RPG-styled combat, the beautifully expanded and revisioned Midgar, to the absolute banger of a soundtrack this game is packing. Seriously, the sound team was on a whole nother level with this one, even bringing in Keiki Kobayashi, one of my favorite composers more notably known for his work in the Ace Combat franchise. The OST also had a bit more of an FF13 series influence to it, which was great for me since I loved the sound style from those games. Speaking on the combat though, I felt the system designed for this game was absolutely brilliant. The mixing of both real-time action combat with the freeze-time menu system worked so incredibly well. It was something that gave you a lot of options, as well as really allow you to pace yourself if you wanted to have it fast-paced in some sections and slow in others, mix it up on the fly, or just go all in on one style. The ability to freely and smoothly swap between party members on the fly was so seamless and really opened up your strategic options as well as create some really awesome combos. The stagger system also worked very well in conjunction with these systems to really help get that much needed edge over a tough enemy. Speaking of tough enemies, I also thoroughly enjoyed this game's difficulty, especially on hard mode. Hard mode wasn't just simply a cheap stat modifier that most games with varying difficulties tend to do. On hard mode, a lot of the bosses gain new attacks and abilities, sometimes changing up the normal flow of the fight into something completely different. In my opinion, this is hard mode done right, and FF7 Remake certainly got it right. Re-experiencing Midgar in this new light was something out of a dream, especially in the remake's stunning visuals. Granted, it wasn't all perfect. Certain areas like the slums had some really low-res textures on obvious, in-your-face objects like doors and such, which kinda stick out like a sore thumb. Despite that though, everything else was very beautiful, and I felt they captured the gritty, cyberpunkish style of Midgar very well here. I also appreciated some of the smaller details presented in the remake, such as the materia actually being visible on your weapon after installing them. The other aspect of re-experiencing Midgar that I loved was the expansion of lore and focus on characters that didn't really get much in the way of relevance in the original game, like Biggs, Wedge, Jesse, and Johnny. And without getting into any spoilers, I'm on the side of people who are excited with the direction they took at the end of Part 1. It leaves a lot more to look forward to when the later parts release, as well as keep things fresh. It also makes sense from a vision point of view, since the FF7 project was originally supposed to be much larger and grandiose in scale, which is why things like Advent Children, Crisis Core, Dirge of Cerberus, and other content like books and an anime were made. They weren't able to fully realize their vision before due to many limitations, but now it's a possibility, and I am fully on board with the ride after having so much fun with Part 1. With all of the changes they've made with the FF7 remake, I am very eager to see what the future holds for this project, and I'm quite content with placing it in my number 5 spot. In number 4, we have Valkyria Chronicles 4. I've been a fan of the Valkyria Chronicles series ever since the first game landed on the PS3. It was something I felt was very refreshing to see in the genre of strategy RPGs, with the addition of more real-time feedback from the AI while moving around the map. It added a nice lifelike element to the genre, where enemies would attack you if you got close and were within their sight lines, and vice versa. Whereas almost every other strategy RPG would usually have the enemy just patiently wait for their turn to even retaliate while you freely wreak havoc on their resources. Great writing and a huge cast of very well-developed, well-written main characters and side characters alike were another of this series' strengths, and why I hold it very close. Valkyria Chronicles 4 was certainly no exception to that, and definitely saw itself a lot of improvements in both quality of life and mechanical after the first title and subsequent PSP and region exclusive titles. Much like the Devil May Cry series, Valkyria Chronicles 4 had to come back very strong after a spin-off Black Sheep release known as Valkyria Revolution, and strong was it ever. Valkyria Chronicles 4 pushed your strategic options even further by adding in features like the APC to transport large groups of your soldiers across long distances in a short amount of time, the leader-follow system, the ship assist system you gain access to later on, as well as bringing back grenadiers. The action was a lot larger in scale, and the weather system was interesting as well. The story this time around told a very heart-wrenching tale of war, and explored a different perspective of conflict that I was very emotionally invested in compared to the first game. The characters went through a lot of growth through some of the tough decisions they had to make along the way, and I was completely invested in all of that since I clicked more with the character dynamic of Squad E compared to Squad 7 from the first game. This game was an absolute emotional roller coaster all the way through, and it honestly had me tearing up toward the end, which doesn't usually happen. I can count on one hand every time that's happened to me from a video game or a movie, and Valkyria Chronicles 4's ability to do that was nothing short of its great execution of character development, story writing, and acting. This was probably one of the best narrative experiences that I've had from a JRPG in a long time, and it took me by complete surprise. The other aspect of Valkyria Chronicles that's usually done well is how they handle their DLC stories and the unlockable bonuses you get after completing them. Without going into much spoiler territory, let's just say that the things you gain access to this time around with 4's DLC is absolutely bonkers. Way more so than the first game, and I certainly had a lot of fun messing around with those features in the main story and skirmishes while platinuming the game. With Valkyria Chronicles 4 creating such a visceral experience and evoking emotion like no other game before it, it earns its spot as my number 4 on the list. Landing onto number 3 is No Man's Sky. Like mentioned earlier, I've always had a deep interest in almost all things space, whether it comes to the infinite possibilities of planets and landmasses, the prospect of intelligent life existing somewhere out there in the distant cosmos, or the reactions of various forms of matter that make up our stellar formations and various nebulae. Space has always been a fascinating topic to learn about, and it's the distant unknown that we may never discover that drives so much of this intrigue. No Man's Sky is the complete embodiment of all of this, and it allows me to truly play out my fantasy of space travel through a seemingly infinite universe in the comfort of my own home. In the beginning, No Man's Sky had a bit of a troubled launch, which wasn't something that affected me very much since I still loved the game for what it was and had a lot of fun with it back then, but there's no denying that many people had various issues with it at launch. Despite that though, No Man's Sky has come a long way from those early days and has made an incredibly successful comeback since then. The idea of many other travelers plotting their own courses through the galaxy, but having an extremely low chance of actually bumping into each other, was such an interesting concept that really gives you an idea of how massive the galaxy is. On the flip side to that though, it was a super cool idea that the Nexus feature was added, which acts as a hub that can link to any star system for many travelers to meet, trade, go on quests together, and do so much more. It was a neat way to make the online interactions more accessible and convenient for those that want it, while still allowing for the more solo space exploration feeling for those that want that. I always found it super interesting, the fact that you can essentially be a space pioneer and completely claim and name as many planets as you want, so long as you were the first one to discover them. Not only that, but every life form and object on that planet can also be named to whatever you desire to completely personalize that planet as your discovery, and any other traveler that happens upon that planet will see everything as such. I found that to be such a cool idea and concept, especially when you consider how massive No Man's Sky's universe is, to where it would take trillions of actual real years for people to discover every planet in the game. That's absolutely mind-blowing in scale. The base building and all of the many systems involved with it was another amazing feature that adds a lot more to the personalization aspect of your planet. Being able to build and design your own personal base any way you want on your own personal favorite planet allows you to really create a home away from home. Then there's the VR. These guys already gave me a great experience with space travel, but now they're letting me actually put myself in the action and completely immerse myself as if I'm actually in space. As far as dreams go, this is practically living a dream, and I couldn't be more happy with the inclusion of VR support for No Man's Sky. You get a true understanding of the scale of everything once you slap on that VR headset and go exploring, and it's a remarkably amazing experience. There are so many other features that I love about the game, such as exocrafts for planetary travel, the ships, owning freighters, space combat, the anomalies and backstories of the alien races. So many things that I feel have been massive improvements and so enjoyable to the experience overall. I could go on and on about all the things I love about No Man's Sky, but essentially, this was a dream game for me, which allowed me to experience one of my biggest interests in an amazing way, and allowed me to discover my number 3 spot on the list. Flying through to number 2 is Ace Combat 7. Among my interests of space travel and sci-fi, my interests in the Air Force and flying are also very high up there with them. Ace Combat was a series that first gave me exposure to the aircraft scene, and I've grown up along with the series ever since the first game on PS1. The series has always been known for its really fun and frantic aerial combat, great and unique level design, and, not until Ace Combat 3 and onward, its great storytelling and expansive world lore. I've always been drawn to these games for the dramatic wartime stories, especially after Ace Combat 4, 5, and 0 raised the bar for the series in that regard, the amazing heavy-hitting soundtracks, and of course the presentation of so many state-of-the-art aircraft and technology from various countries. Ace Combat managed to bring itself back into relevancy after a long period of dormancy and a bit of troubled development with the 7th installment, and in a big way. Ace Combat 7 revitalized the series a lot with its wealth of new features, improved physics, jaw-dropping visuals, and the integration of gameplay elements from previous games. One of the biggest and most notable features was the addition of the Cloud system. I loved this system because it added an extra layer of strategy to the combat for both single player and multiplayer in the way that cloud layers are able to confuse the targeting systems of many weapons such as missiles, or just outright negate certain weapons like lasers. The clouds were also very beautifully designed. I don't think I've seen a game with clouds that looked anywhere near as good as they did here, and looking around while flying through these clouds legitimately looked as if you were flying through thick cloud layers in real life. The other aspect of these clouds that I liked was that the moisture within them would freeze over your cockpit canopy and eventually cause icing on your jet if you remain in them for too long. Many other weather effects such as thunderstorms, rain, and sandstorms looked beautiful and affected the gameplay in dynamic ways. The improved physics also made the flying in this game feel incredible, especially when it came to areas that had rough turbulence that would forcibly veer you off course, or turbulence you would experience in thick cloud layers. I also really liked that they brought back the aircraft tree and part system that Ace Combat Infinity introduced. It was a feature that I felt was a very welcome addition to the series since it added a nice tuning aspect to the game. You were essentially able to create aircraft builds, or fine-tune an aircraft the way you want, and improve various performance aspects. This game also came with VR functionality that, much like No Man's Sky, provided an amazing experience for someone wanting to feel like they were actually sitting in a real-life jet. The aircraft models looked fantastic and very realistic both inside and out, which made the VR experience that much more immersive. Couple that with a nice flight stick, and you've got quite the amazing flying experience on your hands. The other thing I really appreciated Ace Combat 7 for doing was actually making a lot of effort to link the various games together into one large continuity through the various references made throughout the Ace Combat timeline. The story in Ace Combat 7 was pretty strong and had some really interesting concepts, such as the 444th Fighter Squadron Penal Unit. All in all, I had an amazing experience through and through with Ace Combat 7, so much so that I can easily pick it back up after beating it multiple times and still have a lot of fun with it. This game was an experience like no other, and it lands very comfortably on the number 2 spot. And finally, sitting in the number 1 spot is Monster Hunter World Iceborne. This game excelled far above what I was expecting from my past experiences with the series, especially when it came down to the world design, wildlife AI, and the wealth of features and quality of life changes. The thing that always blew me away, and still does to this day, is how well designed and lifelike the wildlife is in this game. Other games may contain wildlife, but usually that's about the extent, with the wildlife just simply existing and not really doing much besides wandering around aimlessly. In Monster Hunter World, the wildlife actually feels like they're living and breathing realistically within their environment due to their subroutines and dynamic interactions with various other creatures and elements around them. A great example of this is with Great Jagras. If you decide to just observe a Great Jagras' behavior instead of just simply attacking it straight away, you'll be witness to its hunting habits. You'll see what kinds of creatures it primarily feasts on, how it devours its prey whole, brings it back to its den to then regurgitate a portion of its kill, signal to smaller Jagras that it's feeding time, and then retreat further into its den to slowly digest the rest of it. When I discovered this, I was blown away by the sheer depth of interactions between species and environment, and it doesn't stop there. Almost all the different creatures and monsters interact with their native environment in unique and interesting ways, from just simply eating, drinking, or sunbathing to the dynamic and game-changing mechanic of turf wars. Turf wars and the fact that multiple monsters can exist in the same area at the same time was such a great addition to the series, since it added a nice unpredictability element and made hunts so much more dynamic and interesting. It also added more to the lifelike nature of the game, as it gave a platform for demonstrating the power levels and intelligence between various predators. I found it so interesting to see the results of who would win between two apex predators, two elder dragons, or just outright watch an apex predator dominate its territory versus a weaker monster. On the smaller scale, there are even unique interactions between various Grimalkines that happen in the background of every level at certain times of the day or during certain weather conditions that might be difficult to notice unless you were really looking for them. Even the fact that not all monsters are instantly aggressive to you on sight is a small thing that goes a long way to making a very believable wildlife experience. All of this came together brilliantly to create an amazingly immersive and believable world where I'm constantly discovering new things. I felt that all of the new monsters were really cool and great additions to the series, especially with how relevant they were to their environment lore-wise. Capcom really improved the series with World by making things significantly less clunky and tedious from past titles by changing the way that healing works and streamlining certain mechanics like mining. Once Iceborne released, I believe that Capcom could do no wrong, since they literally added in everything I could possibly want, plus more. They added in all my favorite monsters like Zinogre, Nargacuga, Barioth, Brachydios, and Alatreon. Even the additional subspecies, variants, and new monsters were super interesting and a breath of fresh air. I thoroughly enjoyed how Capcom kept the online and community space going through their frequent use of seasonal events and siege quests such as Kulf Taroth and Safi Jiva. They even concluded the game by adding in one of the most epic fights ever with Fatalis. I also felt that the Clutch Claw, while not perfect, was another great idea for the series since it allows you to interact with the monster in a unique way besides just simply slapping it with your weapon over and over again. I would love to see the Clutch Claw return in a future title if they were to rework how the tenderizing mechanic worked and just rebalance it overall. All in all, Monster Hunter World and Iceborne was an amazing experience from beginning to end, and I look forward to seeing how future entries learn and improve from this formula. I felt that the improvements to combat and the emphasis on the world were perfectly executed, and some of the many reasons why I consider Monster Hunter World Iceborne as one of my favorite games of the generation, as well as why it managed to claw itself into my #1 spot. So that concludes my top 10 list of the 8th generation. I hope you enjoyed watching, and let me know if there were any games on this list that you also enjoyed a lot as well, or if there were games not on this list that resonated more with you. I hope 2020 fared well for you all despite all the craziness, and now that we are into the new year, I hope 2021 goes well for everyone. Take care, and thanks for watching.